As our best of series rolls on, we start to take a look at some of the Raiders draft picks from 2025. That's coming up on Tuesday's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast for June 24th, 2025.
You are Locked On Raiders, your daily Las Vegas Raiders podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome in, Raider Nation, to another edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen of the day. Definitely appreciate you. If you're catching the show wherever you find your favorite podcast, or you're checking us out by way of the YouTube page, we appreciate both. Show continues to grow each and every day because of your consistent support and the great job that my man Ari does behind the scenes, making sure we look good and sound good each and every day. Even when it's the best of series, even when I'm on vacation, Ari is putting in the heavy lift and doing a great job. So we definitely appreciate him. You can check him out on Twitter at Ari Produces. You can hit me up as well at your boy Q254. And if you want to be a part of the show, as many of you do, we got the Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line at 707-654-4693. We won't have any calls or texts the rest of the week, though. We'll get back to those calls and texts next week when we get back to normal programming. But right now, we've got the best of series rolling on. Today on the show, we'll deep dive into some draft picks, rounds 3 through 6, I should say, on today's show. Ian Cummings is going to talk all things Raider draft picks, and Grace Lawerence from KBZK, Montana State. She's a sideline reporter there. We'll talk about Touchdown Tommy Mellott. So a handful of Raider draft picks from the 2025 draft class we'll talk about and hear about on today's show. We'll jump into that after I tell you about the title sponsor of the show. That's FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. We'll tell you more about them later on in the show. So off top, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Grace Lawerence from KBZK, Montana State sideline reporter, does a fantastic job. She joined my radio show to talk about all things Touchdown Tommy Mellott. Remember, he was a quarterback, FCS quarterback, but the Raiders drafted him and announced him as a wide receiver. So he's going to be a guy that can do the special teams. He could be the wide receiver. He could be very Julian Edelman-like, and that's, as a matter of fact, one of his favorite players that he grew up looking at, watching, just kind of modeling his game after. So he's got some Julian Edelman to him. Again, a 6th-round pick and a guy who's very intriguing. It's funny what the Raiders did. They went and got 2 FCS guys back-to-back in the 6th round. Touchdown Tommy Mellott got a lot of conversation, and then the quarterback Cam Miller as well. But this is all about Touchdown Tommy. So here's my conversation with Grace Lawerence from KBZK, Montana State sideline reporter. We welcome in Grace Lawerence from KBZK, Montana Sports, does sideline reporting for Montana State. And Grace, thanks so much for your time. Definitely appreciate you. And so I was excited to have you on the show because, there's nobody that has a better job in covering football than the sideline reporter, first of all. You get to see everything up close and personal. You get to know these guys, just kind of their mannerisms on the sidelines and everything. So what can you tell us about Tommy? Like, what does he bring to the table for a quarterback / wide receiver, just an all-in-all leader to the team?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me. Just like you said, being a sideline reporter is so much fun, and especially when you get to be on the sidelines for a couple of seasons for Tommy Mellott's career. He won the Walter Payton this past season, which is the top offensive player in the FCS. But I would say his biggest things on the sidelines are his intangibles and his leadership. You can ask anyone on the team. He just sets a certain standard. The past few years he's been at Montana State. He really is the culture of Montana State, and they're definitely going to be building on that now that he's in the league. But that, and I would tell you, his speed is next level. The way he slips secondaries, the way he can make something out of nothing and just see the field. His speed, seeing that up close and personal, you blink and he's down the field.
What is it that makes him go? From being a super athlete, seems like he could do anything on the field, but then he also goes into the classroom and has phenomenal grades and takes courses that are not just some like underwater basket weaving. He's taking big-time courses as well. Kind of, what is it that just makes him go?
Yeah, actually last year he won. He was the top academic scholar in the league as well. So he is everything. He was Prospect X this year. The ESPN article picks one guy who kind of flew under the radar, maybe from a smaller school, and his teammates call him a machine. I really just think it's his motor. When you're around him, he's just so dialed and so detailed, and he cares so much about the final product and so much about his teammates around him. When I would do walk-off interviews with him, he would be, maybe the reason they sparked a comeback or they sparked a win. They had an undefeated regular season. They made it all the way to the championship game this year. But the first people he would credit was his O-line. He would credit his O-line, his coaching staff, his plan. I really think it comes from his motor and his upbringing, and he's somebody who you just can't tell no. I mean, just being around him for a couple of years, he just has a drive that is very rare in my opinion.
Grace Lawerence, she's a sideline reporter for Montana State football, is with us here on Raider Nation Radio 920. Unnecessary roughness. So he's a quarterback, but he's announced as a wide receiver, and as I mentioned, kind of the Julian Edelman type role. I know he's mentioned a guy like Julian Edelman. How do you think he goes with that switch to the NFL?
Yeah, I think it's a lot with his size and his drive and his motor. It's very cool. When we were able to talk to him on Pro Day about a month and a half ago, he ran a 4.39 40, a 41-inch vertical. He's extremely athletic. They used him before I got here when he was a true freshman or a redshirt freshman or whatnot. They used him all around the field on the offense and on special teams. So he has some experience kind of all over the offense, but quarterback was what they needed for their team to win. The coolest story he gave us in Pro Day, because I asked him, I said, what have you been studying? What receivers or, maybe smaller school quarterbacks have you been studying to make that switch to receiver? And when he played little kid football his first season, he randomly had a Julian Edelman jersey. That is the jersey they gave him. And he just really fell in love with the player and his work ethic and everything. And Edelman was just a punt returner. He was a rookie that year. But ever since then, there's been a little tie, which is really cool. But, I think it's going to be a great switch. I think it's going to start on special teams and kind of see where it goes. But he was doing receiver drills at the Pro Day. He was doing some punt returning drills at the Pro Day. He just has a very good IQ as well, the way he sees the field. There's some snaps that maybe wouldn't go his way during the season. Specifically, one that stands out was the semifinal FCS game against South Dakota this past December. The snap kind of went up in the air, and he hurdled a defender basically and ran it, 30, 40 yards up the field. He just can kind of make something out of nothing, and he has a really good vision for the field.
Yeah, and it sounds like that he wants to do some punt returning in the NFL if he can because of, what he was doing on special teams and the fact that, Julian Edelman did that punt returning and he's always kind of looked up to him. So he looks like a guy that if you put him on the field, he's basically willing to do anything that you ask him. Yeah,
and that's how he was at Montana State. That was kind of the best part about watching the offense. It's a very prolific run game, especially I think they ranked second in the nation the past couple of years. But the second X factor of the offense, it was the run game and it was Tommy Mellott. I just could not imagine being an opposing defense, an opposing defensive coordinator and trying to game plan for Tommy. What he gave Montana State and the offense, just everything. He can kind of just make, I keep saying it, but make something out of nothing, which I think is going to be really special. I'm so excited. The day he got drafted here, you opened social media, and it literally felt like a national holiday, not just in Bozeman, but probably the entire state of Montana. He's from Butte, Montana, which is about, an hour and a half up the highway. And he just brought so many fans into Montana State from across the state, and I know they are so excited to cheer him on.
I have no doubt about it. I know that that's a big deal for him to get drafted, and obviously that's going to help out with recruiting. That's going to help out with everything just because a guy from there can make it to the National Football League like Tommy has, being a sixth-round pick of the Raiders. And it's funny you mentioned that Prospect X article on ESPN. Kaylin Kaler is the one who wrote that. We had her on the show as well, and she talked about it in her article. She says how John Spytek and Tom McMahon, the special teams coordinator for the Raiders, nobody showed Tommy any kind of attention, didn't bring him in for a visit because they didn't want to put it on the radar of other teams. What does that say about that player when they didn't want anyone to know that they had interest because they wanted to make sure they had a chance to draft him?
It's just incredible. Everyone, you always want to be that one that has that guy that flew under the radar. And I honestly was a bit shocked after Pro Day. He had a couple visits. I know a team came to work him out at Montana State, but I even expected some more hype. But that just goes to show that they all knew that Tommy would make an impact. And I think Tommy, like you were saying, it's also his drive off the field that I'm sure sold so many teams. He's just a great person to be around. He inspires his teammates. But like you're saying, it's just pretty cool. I mean, that when that article came out, us in Bozeman, we kind of were like, okay. I mean, it's just some of the little tidbits. They had a playoff game against Idaho on a Friday night on ESPN, and he was supposed to walk in graduation that day, but they had practice. So he opted to practice and play that night. And it was pretty funny in the post-game press conference. I'm just reflecting back on those moments, how his teammates think he's a machine. Brent Vegan, an incredible head coach for the program. He's coached some pretty great quarterbacks as well that are now in the league. So that article was just so cool. And that kind of started putting it more on the radar, like, all right, he's going to go. We knew he was going to go. We just kind of didn't know when.
What does that mean? Like I said, I know it's a big deal that he got drafted there at Montana State. I know everyone's proud of him, even just from around the surrounding areas. But what does that mean for Montana State? What does that mean for the program to see their guy, the guy that just played the championship game against, oh, by the way, the guy that the Raiders drafted right after him, Cam Miller from North Dakota State? What does that mean for him to get drafted? Like, how proud is everyone for him?
Yeah, how about that? That is so cool to see two FCS guys who had such a history, playing against one another, both up for the Walter Payton this year. That was so cool. Two guys who are so great at their craft, who care so much about that level. I mean, it matters a lot, the current landscape of FCS football. These best guys, they jump in the portal, they're going to go FCS. But what really keeps some of these guys here is the fact that they're from Montana. And I know that was such a huge thing for Tommy. He's the pride. They call him the pride of Butte, the pride of the state. It means so much. I mean, there's a couple guys in the league. You think like Troy Anderson, he went pretty high a couple years ago. It means so much to the program and their recruiting. And his ability, I think, to, be all over the field and do whatever they're going to need him to do at the next level is so huge. But it matters a lot, in the national landscape where you can come to an FCS program and you can make such a statement. And it's just really special here. It's a true culture. And Bobcat Stadium, there's a few FCS, these mecca of the FCS places that just they pull in these amazing crowds. This is their pro team. Montana State, Bobcats, and the Montana Grizz. Those are the kind of the two pro teams. That's how they roll in Montana. And when it's a sellout every Saturday, no matter who they're playing, to see a guy like Tommy, and years from now, if Tommy were to make it, I know that these Montana residents and everyone who got to see him the past 4 or 5 years and had their photo with him from the rivalry game or whatever, they get to say, that's our guy. He's from Montana. And it just matters so much to the people here. And it's crazy how many Raiders fans there probably will be here, and kids, because, there is no pro team here. So there's probably going to be a lot of little kids that looked up to Tommy in college that maybe don't have a pro team, and they jump on the Raiders bandwagon and become a Tommy Mellott fan for the Raiders.
That was all things Touchdown Tommy right there from Grace Lawerence from KBZK. She's a Montana State sideline reporter, does a fantastic job and a wealth of knowledge when it came to Tommy Mellott and what he brings to the table. Again, remember, he was a quarterback at Montana State, but announced as a wide receiver. So we'll see what the Raiders do with him. We'll see what he does in training camp. I thought it was really cool the way that it went about, where they kept him off the radar and kept him off of other teams' radars by not showing any interest, didn't go to his pro day. The special teams coordinator wasn't talking about him when other special teams coordinators might have been mentioning him in group chats, and just acted like they knew nothing about the guy, and then selected him in round number 6. So that was Touchdown Tommy. Got a handful of players that you're going to hear a great breakdown on from Ian Cummings. Matter of fact, that'll be in segment number 2 and segment number 3. We'll do it next here on today's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Before we get to that, though, I do want to tell you about the title sponsor of the show, and that is FanDuel. The NBA Finals done deal records. Every night delivered highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't miss moments. So it's not over because the NBA season's over. Oh, no. Now Major League Baseball, full throttle, right? We really pay attention to what's going on there. Player prop bets, you can get that. Favorite teams that are streaking, everything that you want to have a part of the action. You can always get a piece of the action, Major League Baseball related. Aaron Judge, all rise, home run chase, Shohei Ohtani when it comes to strikeouts, now that he's back on the mound and hitting home runs, all that could be part of your FanDuel bet. If you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com, place your first $5 bet. If you win, it's going to get you $200 in bonus bets. Again, you want to stay in the action. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Raider Nation, here we go. Segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Time to deep dive into a handful of Raider draft picks from the 2025 draft class. And here in segment number 2, Ian Cummings from Pro Football Network, he's going to talk all things third-round picks, offensive lineman. Charles Grant, the tackle from William & Mary, the big fella, and Caleb Rogers, the guard from Texas Tech. So here in segment number 2, you'll hear Ian Cummings break down the offensive linemen that the Raiders added a little bit of depth to the offensive line, and some guys that don't get caught slipping if you hear their name during training camp. They're not some guys that are just expected to make an impact like in year 2 or year 3. These are some guys that can make an impact even in their rookie year. Here's part 1 of that conversation. Talk about those offensive linemen with Ian Cummings from Pro Football Network. Join us now on the phone lines to talk about Charles Grant and others of the Raiders selections is our guy, Ian Cummings, good friend, NFL draft analyst, ProFootballNetwork.com. And Ian, thanks so much for your time. Definitely appreciate you. We got to talk to you before the draft about some potential guys that the Raiders could select. Now I wanted to go over some guys that the Raiders did select, and we'll start right there with Charles Grant, the big tackle from William & Mary. I know that he's not a finished product, but when you see him, when you hear him, what do you kind of see as far as his NFL trajectory goes?
Yeah, for sure. And first off, great to be on with you again. Great to see you. I mean, after the NFL draft, it's always exciting because you can see these guys in a different lens. Before the draft, it's like, all right, what could happen? Now it's where do they fit with the team that added them, right? And Charles Grant, I kind of pinpointed him as a prospect who would be targeted kind of in that late round 3, early round 4 range, like probably on the boundary of the day 2, day 3, and that's kind of where you got picked. But you are working with a ton of upside there. That's what I would say. 6'5", 311 pounds. You can probably play closer to 320 with an NFL training program, and then almost 35-inch arms. I mean, he's got massive levers for arms, and what he can use that for in pass protection, it's getting to the punch point first. It's outreaching guys and anchoring, but then in the run game too. I mean, he can drive. He'll finish guys in the dirt. He's incredibly physical when it comes to finishing and playing to the whistle. But I think with him, with the baseline of his foundation and his potential is the athleticism. I mean, he's very, very, I think it's mainly linear, explosive athleticism, but especially on reach blocks when you're talking about, getting to the 3-tech, getting to his landmarks, and then flipping his hips around. He's got that mobility in the run game. And then in the pass game, too, there are really bright flashes of matching athleticism, using fast feet to, mirror rushers and stay square, and then using violent hands to latch, anchor, snatch, and trap, whatever it may be. So I think what you're working with in terms of needing to improve, obviously the consistency can be up and down. The leap to the NFL level of competition is going to be a big sticking point for him, seeing if he can adjust to that. And also, I don't think he's the most flexible when it comes to lateral recovery, right? So for that reason, I know a projection to guard has been made by some analysts. I think he could thrive in a move to guard. I think his tools would be borderline dominant in a phone booth. But baseline, you're getting a really rangy physical blocker with the length and the explosion, the athleticism, and the tenacity to kind of fit the mentality they want on that line. But at the very least, tackle guard depth and has developmental potential.
What kind of blocking scheme do you think fits him best?
It's tricky. I think he does have enough range for his own blocking scheme. But I also think the farther you go in reps, because he's not the most flexible in his midsection, some guys who are taller, if they're doing a outside zone or a wide zone block, if they're drifting too tall, that can impact their control later in reps when obviously you need to stack blocks, you need to move to the second level, you need to keep guys within your frame. And I do think that's an area where he struggles a little bit more. I always thought that, as a gap blocker, right, where he can get to his landmark, hinge around on those reach blocks. I mean, those are some of his most impressive blocks on tape, where he's using that initial lateral explosion off the line to get outside at the 3-tech or the 4-high and then hinge and then seal off that gap for the runners to get upfield. So, inside zone, gap, power, I think all of those fit well. And I do think he has enough range for outside and wide zone, but the farther he goes, the less control he has. So you want him to continue to improve that. But the appeal with the complete physical skill set, with the length, the explosion, the athleticism, is that ideally he can be a seam diverse blocker down the line. It's just a matter of where you would slot him, a tackle or guard. If it were me, I'd probably have more of a long-term vision for him at guard, but I also think, immediate depth at tackle, he's got the utility for that. He started, I think, over 30 games at William & Mary at tackle, so definitely has the experience. But a pretty scheme-diverse blocker in theory, probably best in gap and inside zone early on, but does have enough athleticism to potentially translate to others if he can improve his control.
Ian Cummings is with us here on Raider Nation Radio 920 Unnecessary Roughness. So when it comes to Charles Grant, and as I mentioned before, his name really started to get a lot of attention towards the end of this draft process. What was it about him that all of a sudden everyone really started talking about him about?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky because obviously wasn't able to participate in the All-Star circuit. I think he was coming back from injury, and he only was able to do the bench press at the NFL Combine, right? So it really wasn't athletic testing or All-Star performance, right? It was more, I just think, getting to the tape and seeing how distinct his set of physical tools was against FCS competition. I take it back to an FCS prospect from the previous cycle, Kieran Amagaji, who went in round 3 to the Chicago Bears. You could turn on his Yale tape, and some of these guys, a lot of these FCS guys, if they're going to go in the early rounds, their physical tools have to be superlative, right? And usually you can see that on the tape if they stand out in a way where they're just kind of outmatching guys with the athleticism, with the length, with the power. And I think that was absolutely the case with Charles Grant. I think you look at the tape, again, the explosiveness, getting to his landmarks in the run game, the matching athleticism and pass protection, the absolute overwhelming wingspan when it comes to anchoring and reaching and getting to, extending and punching and beating the other guy to contact. So, all of those things, when he was at his best, he was dominant at the FCS level, right? So when you see that, it kind of serves as a barometer where you say, hey, I know he can match up at the NFL level. And then I think just for NFL offensive line coaches, they would love the physical temperament that he plays with. I mean, he is a guy who is routinely finishing defenders in the dirt. It's not a one-off thing. I mean, he relishes the chance to, kind of dominate the opponent, the guy lining up across from him. So having that temperament, that tenacity, I have to imagine, Pete Carroll was on board with that. Chip Kelly was on board with that. And I think it's something that'll permeate to the rest of the line as well. So just having that mentality.
Something that I looked at throughout the whole course of the Raiders draft class, all 11 picks, feel like there's a sense of toughness, a little nasty to him, a little edge to him, and it sounds like Charles Grant has all of that as the number 99 overall pick. And Ian, right before that, they had pick number 98. They went with Caleb Rogers, the guard out of Texas Tech, so back-to-back offensive linemen. What could you tell us about Rogers?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I think they're both really athletic, but if I had to kind of draw a dichotomy between them, I'd say Caleb Rogers is definitely he's a little more experienced. He's also a lot more versatile, right? Charles Grant started a lot of games at the collegiate level, but they were all at left tackle. Caleb Rogers started at left tackle, left guard, right tackle, right guard. I mean, almost everywhere but center, Caleb Rogers was taking reps. So I think that's kind of the initial appeal with him, is that he can give you positional flexibility as a depth piece across the offensive line. But I would also say, I think Charles Grant is a little bit more powerful, definitely a lot longer, more powerful than Caleb Rogers. But I think Caleb Rogers is a little bit more fluid and a lot more polished at this point, right? With Caleb Rogers, you're getting a guy who in the run game, he can climb to the second level. I think outside zone, wide zone blocking is definitely more his thing. He can get out in space. He excels when he's getting to the second level and kind of walling off linebackers and driving them out of plays with the leg turn, the explosiveness, the range. But he's got a pretty compact, well-leveraged frame too, where pad level isn't a huge problem for him. He's got good knee bend as well. And then in pass protection too. Obviously having sub 33-inch arms can be an issue for him at times, but, more often than not, I think he's really balanced and well-versed on his kick set. I think he can match guys really well. And then there are a lot of bright flashes with him, using upper-lower synergy, having your feet in the right spot, but then also using your hands to anchor while keeping the rusher within your frame. And he's got a nice circle punch as well, a good sense of timing. So, Cliff Notes version, Charles Grant, a little bit more, well, not a little bit. I think he's a lot more powerful, right? I think that was one of the biggest knocks on Caleb Rogers' tape, is that he doesn't have overwhelming power. I think when he can get his base beneath him and use that explosiveness to channel, I think he can get more of it, right? But you naturally have more raw power with Charles Grant, who's a longer player, right? But Caleb Rogers, to me, while Grant is more powerful and, ideally has a higher ceiling, I think Caleb Rogers has a higher floor, and then he has a lot more positional versatility, right? So you could probably slot him into guard, and he could start games in year one if you need him to. So I think, that's kind of the appeal there. And I like how they play off each other, right? Because if Charles Grant is taking longer with his development, you at least know that you can rely on Caleb Rogers to be that, high-level sixth offensive lineman. I think having that type of player is really valuable.
Very detailed conversation right there with Ian. He was fantastic, man. Had him on my radio show right before the draft, kind of going over some guys that he thought would fit with what the Raiders wanted to do, some guys he had had his eye on. I mean, he does a lot of draft analysts and breaking down a lot of players all year long. Like, the machine does not stop. Really respect him a lot. His draft knowledge is very, very deep, and we're going to go ahead and continue and put that knowledge to the test. Coming up in segment number 3, part 2 of the conversation I had with Ian Cummings, we talk about Darian Porter, we talk about Tonka Hemingway, and J.J. Pegues. So the 2 defensive tackles, round 4 and round 6, and then Darian Porter, the cornerback from Iowa State, in round 3. You'll hear part 2 of that conversation with Ian Cummings coming up in segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Again, the best of series rolling on. Ian Cummings, you heard from him. Part 1 of the conversation, talking 2025 draft picks for the Raiders. Talked all things offensive lineman Charles Grant and Caleb Rogers. Now in segment number 3, Darian Porter, Tonka Hemingway, the Tonka truck, and J.J. Pegues. So those are the 3 that you'll hear him break down coming up right now as Ian Cummings does a fantastic job for Pro Football Network. Join my radio show. Here's part 2 of that conversation. So after the first round, you had tweeted out some of the players that were still available that you were pretty high on. One of those guys was also a 3rd-round pick by the Raiders, cornerback Darian Porter out of Iowa State. And before we get into Porter, I've been telling anyone who will listen that I like Iowa State players because they're coached correctly by Matt Campbell, prepare them for the next level. What is it that you see in just Iowa State prospects in general?
Yeah, it's honestly that. Like, you look at this class in general, Jalen Knoll, Jaden Higgins. They had a couple guys in the secondary that I pinpointed as well. I know Jeremiah Cooper returned to school, but he'll be one to watch. Malik Verdon at safety, just a unit that was really well-rounded. And then getting Jalen Travis from Princeton as well. He went to the Colts in the middle round. I think he'll be a really good swing tackle. They play with toughness. They really do. But I think, especially a wide receiver, both Jalen Knoll and Jaden Higgins on the offensive side, like, those are guys that know their stuff when it comes to, NFL level precision, route running, separation, even though there's some limitations with each. Like, you could see that they were well coached. And then on the defensive side too, all of the guys in the secondary knew their role, right? Darian Porter was a guy who didn't have a ton of experience, but I think you could see right away that, there is a lot of zone intelligence on tape with him. Like, he knows, not to play with too much depth. He knows how to manage route relationships. And that went for everyone in the secondary, whether it was him, Miles Purchase, Jeremiah Cooper, Malik Verdon, anyone. So, I think looking at, how well coached they were, and Matt Campbell is, I think, a defensive coach by background. So it makes sense that, they would know their roles and, know what they need from the guy across from them and how to manage that. But, that's a big part of secondary play in the NFL. One of the biggest parts is, having cohesion with your group. And I think there was a universal understanding of that within the Iowa State secondary. Some secondaries have guys who are big play hunting, trying to get the turnover on every down, kind of bailing on their assignments to try and make a play. But I think in general, if I can condense it into one word, discipline would be that word. I think Iowa State's defense is definitely that. So Darian Porter, kind of all of those qualities precipitate onto him. And on top of that, he's got special teams utility too. So I really like what you're working with. You have a pretty high floor combination if you're working with zone schemes, but then the ceiling is through the roof, being 6'3", 195 pounds, over 33-inch arms with 4.3 speed. I mean, this is a guy who was not going to fall very far, and they took him around 3. So I like the pick a lot, but especially because, like you mentioned, well coached, disciplined, and I think those qualities can underpin the rest of his development.
So with Darian, a lot of the conversation is really good when it comes to zone coverage, needs a little work in man because, well, they don't play a lot of man there at Iowa State. Could you see him turning into a corner that gets comfortable playing in that man scheme?
Potentially. I'm a little hesitant there just because, and it depends on every prospect. Every prospect is different, but I think generally when you're a taller guy, being 6'3", what's one of the most important things you have to do in press man and off man coverage, right? You got to play lower in your stance. You got to be able to match and redirect and react, use that reactionary athleticism to match releases from the guy across from you, whether it's a split release or a diamond release. Like those wide receivers, when you're in man coverage, they can use that lateral agility to offset you, and you got to be able to sync, redirect very efficiently, right? And as good as Darian Porter is in zone, I think one reason that he is good in zone is because he has a lot more space to use his long striding speed, kind of glide in space, right? But if he's at the line, if you're a wide receiver working across from him, it's really easy for that wide receiver to use their superior, fluidity, short area quickness. And Porter is very twitchy, very quick in the short areas, but it's mainly his hip fluidity that concerns me because I think it's really easy for a receiver at the line to draw his pads up with those lateral moves, and then a quick diversion, Darian Porter will have a slight hitch on those because it's a little harder for him to sink his hips, right? And on top of that, too, just there are some technique lapses when he is in man coverage. Inefficient footwork can be an issue. So generally, I think his best fit is going to be mainly in zone looks. But I also think if he can refine his technique a little more, one thing that can counteract a quick receiver at the line, one thing that can counteract release work is length, physicality, right? And having 33-inch arms, having the physicality and the discipline that he has, I do think he could project there. I don't know if he'll ever be an elite man coverage corner because he doesn't quite have that elite hip sink and malleability, but I think there is enough of this skill set to mold where he can be versatile. And the one thing we know about Patrick Graham and his defense, they like to be versatile. They like to be able to play situational football. That's going to be something that Darian Porter will be asked to do. I think his proficiency is zone, but there is some measured man coverage upside.
Yeah, versatility is definitely a key when it comes to Patrick Graham and that defensive scheme. He hit that right on the head. Again, Ian Cummings is with us here on Raider Nation Radio 920. We'll close out with this, Ian, and I'll kind of hit you with a two-for-oneer. I want to ask you about a couple of these defensive linemen that I'm pretty excited about. In round 4, the Raiders got Tonka Hemingway, the big D tackle out of South Carolina. Then round 6, number 180 overall, J.J. Pegues, the defensive tackle out of Ole Miss, who's played a little fullback, scored some touchdowns. What are your thoughts on those two defensive linemen for the Silver and Black?
Yeah, for sure. Tonka Hemingway, I know he's going to be a fan favorite right away. Tonka Truck, the nickname, that's going to stick for sure. But he's a fun player, man. I really love definitely, I think TJ Sanders, his teammate who went a lot earlier, is the more refined player of the two. But with Tonka Hemingway, you've got a lot of the qualities that I look for in a defensive tackle. He's around 6'2", 6'3", he'll play over 300 pounds, probably close to 300, and he's got near 34-inch arms. So really well-leveraged, compact player with that really efficient mass, but then has the proportional length to get inside guys' frames, to outreach interior offensive linemen, to drive power with that sturdy base and that natural leverage that he already has. And, I think at the collegiate level, we saw him use that power from time to time, right? But he's also got some finesse to his game. I remember I was watching Jalen Milroe, Alabama, and he hit Jaden Roberts, a really good offensive guard who returned to school. He hit him with this really, really smooth spin move from the interior, right? Setting the ice pick, really efficient footwork, and then getting into the pocket for the sack. So with Tonka Hemingway, you're looking at natural leverage, proportional length, agility, finesse to go along. Natural power element. Just needs to keep refining his game, add a little bit more bulk to hold up in the run defense. But I really like the dart swing as a developmental player on day 3. And then J.J. Pegues is another one. I think he's a little bit less, not quite as long and powerful, but again, he's really compact and dense with his frame. Being that guy who's 6'2.5", around 310 pounds, I think naturally with his frame, he does hold up a little bit better in run defense, but you also have the athleticism. I mean, to use him as the fullback, like you said. Like, he's not a bad athlete. I think sometimes I think the NFL Combine testing wasn't quite as good as people expected. But again, when it's a defensive tackle, a big thing is like functional athleticism, right? He doesn't have to run a sub 5-second 40-yard dash, right? You look at the tape and he's got pretty good foot speed, pretty good lateral agility, and kind of nimble with his athleticism. And then he can use that to reset his angles. He's got 32.5-inch arms, so enough to club and get past guys. Again, the key with him, too, is going to be refinement, right? I think both of these guys are still trending up with their development, but they both have really appealing physical skill sets. And I think getting them in that defensive tackle rotation, they both have a function that can provide value right away. And you got Christian Wilkins, so, you have some veterans in the room. So it's not going to be an immediate pressure thing for them, but I think down the line they can really provide value for you. There's developmental upside. There's a way to go before they reach the ceiling, but really good value picks in day 3.
Really good stuff right there from Ian Cummings. Again, one of the best to do it as far as I'm concerned, as far as draft analysts. He really does a great job breaking it down, does some deep diving on all these players across college football, FCS level, FBS level. It does not matter. He is all over it like a glove. He's definitely one of my go-tos when it comes time for the draft. We'll continue with the draft conversation coming up on tomorrow's show as our best of series rolls on. Round 4 pick Dante Thornton Jr. from Tennessee. 7th round pick Cody Lindenberg, the linebacker from Minnesota. We'll definitely get some conversation about those guys. You'll hear everything that we know, everything that we were told, right? The conversations I was able to have about those guys, you'll hear that coming up on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. So until then, Raider Nation, take care of yourself, take care of your family, love on your family. Most importantly, as always, just win, baby.